Hello, this is Sarah Braasch. Welcome back to my channel. So I wanted to do one last video about Twitter, specifically tonight, and then I'm going to move on to a different subject. But I'm kind of on a making YouTube videos kick. So we'll keep going as long as my gumption doesn't run out. So I wanted to do a video about how Twitter's Jack Dorsey doesn't seem to understand what a public square is. Okay, so this is something that he said repeatedly, that he wants Twitter to be like a public square where everyone is able to participate and express themselves. And he and others at Twitter have said that their focus in terms of regulating conduct is to focus on behavior. Specifically threats of violence, death threats, harassment, targeted harassment, abusive behavior. But this is clearly, even though that is the stated goal, and that would be that if they were actually doing that at Twitter, that would be what you would need to do in a public square, what the government would have a responsibility to do in a public square. But that is clearly not what is happening at Twitter. And what is happening at Twitter is not at all the way a public square is supposed to be functioning, and it is not being regulated the way the government has a constitutional responsibility to regulate the actual public space that we live in. So what the government has a responsibility to do in regulating the public space is, it's basically a government. The public space is a public forum in which anybody is supposed to be able to express themselves and particularly be able to engage in political speech so that they can participate in the democratic process. And this includes hate speech. And as I've spoke about in our last and our only Three Free Thinkers podcast that I did with Gretchen Mullen at Skeptic Review 89 and with Jim with Out West, is that I lost my train of thought. But anyway, so a public space is a public forum, and you're supposed to be and I remember, even if that political speech is considered hateful, and as I said on the Three Free Thinkers podcast, hate speech is a legally meaningless term. It refers to nothing. It's a null term. It's meaningless, legally speaking. So you should be able to engage in hateful speech. And as I also discussed on the podcast, do you know whose speech is most often deemed hateful? The oppressed, minorities, the dissenting voice, by the powerful and by the government. Of course they are. So this whole idea that we want government defining what is and is not, or that we want Twitter defining what is, if they truly want Twitter to be the social media platform, to be a public square, to be like the public space, the idea that we want Twitter defining what is and is not hate speech is ludicrous. And we've seen the ill effects. The ill effects are obvious. So in a public square, basically the paramount role of the government is to make sure that no one is being excluded from speaking, and that that there's no segregation taking place. So they have a responsibility to make sure that everyone has the ability to participate and engage in political free speech and participate in the democratic process. And I have a very French view of the public space, and I do believe, as the French feel very strongly as well, that free and unfettered access to the public space is part and parcel of your citizenship, and I completely concur with that idea, with that train of thought. And I do support, even though I've been very clear that I oppose hate crime legislation as grossly unconstitutional, I absolutely support federal civil rights law because I see those measures as public desegregation measures. Okay, you need to have full and free and unfettered access to the public space to be able to engage in the political process and express yourself, even if someone deems your speech hateful, which means nothing legally, means absolutely nothing legally. And the only reason why people think that hate speech isn't constitutionally protected is because we have hate crime legislation, and we should not have hate crime legislation because hate crime legislation is thought and speech crime, and it's grossly unconstitutional, and that's why I oppose it. And I've been very vocal about that for years and years. So anyway, so the role of the government then is to focus on behavior, is to make sure that no one is being segregated out of the public space. No one is being excluded. And this is why threats, death threats, threats of violence are not free speech. This is why defamation is not free speech. This is why harassment is not free speech. All of that is true, and Twitter's correct in saying that they're going to focus on behavior, focus on harassment. They do not focus on defamation, and I don't believe they've said that they're going to focus on defamation, which is wrong. Defamation is not free speech. You don't get to tell lies about people to destroy them, to harm them, their reputations and their livelihoods. So anyway, so yes, so a public square, that is what a public square is. So if Twitter wants to be a public square, then Jack et al. Need to make some very significant changes to the Twitter's terms of service. Okay? So it should not be then, if you're thinking of Twitter as being like the government regulating the public square, they should not be regulating for what they deem to be hate speech, which is what they're doing, and they have a very obvious bias in that regard, in that they basically have been kicking people off the platform, me included, left and right, for straying even a hair from woke intersectional feminism dogma. And that's very clear. It's very, very clear that that's what's been happening. So they have not been focusing on behavior. They have not at all been focusing on behavior. And I'll just point out, as I've done many times before, that Twitter allowed the woke intersectional feminists on Twitter, including public figures with blue check marks and millions of followers, to use the most derogatory, disgusting, abusive, hateful language towards me, to target me with the most egregious abuse and harassment imaginable. Twitter didn't care. Twitter didn't care. Jack didn't care. No one cared. No one cared. No one cared that I was getting death threats. No one cared that I was being harassed and abused and forced off Twitter. No one cared. Why? Because it was the woke intersectional feminists who were saying things to me like that I'm so ugly that I need to go hang myself like my dead brother. Okay? So basically, Twitter are just a bunch of liars, and they say they focus on behavior and they want Twitter to be a public square, but they're really doing nothing of the kind. So I just wanted to talk about that and make that clear. And I know that we're going to do an upcoming 3 Free Thinkers podcast with me and Jim and Gretchen, and we're going to talk exactly about this issue, about free speech on social media. Okay, and before we do that, I'm going to get myself acquainted with the current state of the law in that regard. Okay, I love you all so much. My PayPal, me, and GoFundMe links are below. Support me as I continue to fight for justice. Be safe and well out there, kids. And we're going to get through this moment of cultural insanity together. And we're going to get through this pandemic together, too. I love you all so much. Take care. Okay, good night.